Thank you. Thank you to the Mill Valley Library Foundation and the Friends for their ongoing and generous support of First Fridays and other programs at the library. If you like what you see here, and we hope that you do, please consider showing your support by attending the Foundation's annual fundraiser, the Beyond the Book Bash, next Saturday night at 142 Throckmorton Theater. You can also drop by the Friends of the Library's annual 2-day book sale next Saturday and Sunday. 2 great ways to support the library. We have bookmarks at the reference desk, which tonight is our wine bar, if you'd like more information on both events. Our First Fridays are often promoted as presenting perspectives that an audience might otherwise not consider. They are also often about an exploration of the narrative form, the many ways in which a story can be told. Tonight's speaker, Jeanne Woodford, is likely to provide an example of both, providing a unique point of view strongly rooted in her own story as well as in the stories of others. Ms. Woodford's perspective comes in part from overseeing 4 executions at San Quentin, giving her a direct look into the complex issue of the death penalty from many angles, politically, socially, and intimately. Ms. Woodford began work as a correctional officer in 1978 at San Quentin at a time when female correctional officers were not so common, and worked there for 26 years, becoming the prison's first female warden in 1999. She is known for being a champion of evidence-based rehabilitation programs and for taking an interest in the lives of the prisoners themselves. She left San Quentin in 2004 and worked briefly as the director of the State Department of Corrections, followed by another brief stint as San Francisco's Chief Adult Probation Officer before retiring from the corrections field in 2008. In April of last year, she became the director of Death Penalty Focus, an organization that is working to pass Prop 34, the initiative on the November ballot in California that would replace the death penalty with life in prison without possibility of parole. A June 2012 article in San Francisco Magazine called The Repentant Executioner referred to Ms. Woodford as a reform-minded soccer mom ex-warden. Surely a string of words that cannot be used to describe too many people. Please join me in welcoming Jeanne Woodford.
So libraries have changed. I just don't remember a wine bar in the libraries I went to. This is very nice. What an incredible turnout on a Friday night. And this is for such a serious subject. So I, again, am Jeanne Woodford, and I am the official proponent of the Safe California Yes on 34 campaign. So I'm here to talk to you about why I am the proponent. And I'm going to start out with telling you what SAFE stands for. So SAFE stands for Savings, Accountability, and Full Enforcement. Savings to the state, savings to local communities, and savings to local counties. Accountability, because offenders will spend the rest of their lives in prison working and paying restitution. And full enforcement, as Proposition 34 directs resources to a major public safety concern, which is the fact that we have 46% of homicides and 56% of reported rapes that go unsolved each year on average in the state of California. That is why you will join with me, I know, to vote yes on 34 in November. I want to start out by telling you we made history this year with the qualification of the Safe California Initiative, now known as Yes on 34, for 2 reasons. Number 1, a Yes on 34 vote will replace the death penalty with a sentence of life without parole as the maximum punishment in the state of California. And number 2, in November of 2012, it will be the first time in California that the voters will have an opportunity to vote on the issue of the death penalty, fully informed of the cost of the death penalty in the state. There have been past votes on the death penalty, but this time it's different. It's different because it will be the first time that you will choose between the death penalty and an alternative that provides justice and savings. It will be different because voters like you will be fully informed, and it will be personal. Let me start by telling you about myself to explain what I mean by personal vote, for me and I think for you. Some people are surprised that an ex-warden of San Quentin would be against the death penalty. And what I say to people is, I would be surprised if the ex-warden of any prison that housed death row inmates and carried out execution wasn't against the death penalty. I started at San Quentin State Prison in 1978, 2 weeks after graduating from Sonoma State University with a degree in criminal justice. One of the first women to work in the housing units of San Quentin State Prison. When I started there in 1978, there were 6 inmates on death row. 6. Today, there are 729 inmates on death row, and that includes the 19 women that are housed at Central California Women's Facility. California has the largest death row in the nation. I feel like I grew up with the death penalty because I've seen it from every point of view, from the point of view of my staff, from the point of view of the inmates, from the point of view of victims' family members, and from the point of view of the family members of the inmates who are on death row. I also tell people I've seen the best and the worst of our government. Having spent over 26 years at San Quentin and carrying out 4 executions, I can say what few other people can say, and more of us, former wardens like myself, all across this country are coming out in opposition to the death penalty. I'm speaking out because I care about innocence. Over 100 innocent people have been sentenced to death in the United States, and some have been executed. This is a terrible toll for anyone to bear, whether you are in the execution chamber or whether you sat on the jury that gave the death penalty, or whether you're at the ballot box making a decision about this issue. And I tell people the story of Troy Davis. Anybody here not know the story of Troy Davis? Just raise your hand. It's okay if you haven't. So, Troy Davis was on death row in the state of Georgia. And there are many questions about his guilt or innocence, and we simply don't know. We don't know whether he's guilty. We don't know whether he was innocent. Several of the eyewitnesses against him, I believe there were 6, 5 of the 6 recanted and said that they were pressured into identifying Troy Davis. So there were lots of other concerns about his guilt. So we did what we always do. We wrote letters to the state of Georgia. We mobilized people all across the country to write to the state of Georgia saying, you must stop this execution. And of course, none of that worked. So the day of the execution, I come to work and I said, there must be one more thing that we can do. So I got on the phone and I called other wardens, including the former warden of Georgia, and said, we have to do something. So we sent a letter to Georgia, signed by the 6 of us. And the letter said, don't do this to your staff. You simply don't know. You don't know whether he's guilty, you don't know whether he's innocent, but what we do know is your staff will have to live with that doubt for the rest of their lives. Sadly, that letter didn't do any good, but it did create a lot of media attention on thinking about what we're asking public servants to do when we ask them to carry out the death penalty. Proposition 34 means that we will never execute an innocent person in California. It means that we will never make an irreversible mistake. Now, many people think, well, that happens in Texas, that happens in Georgia. Just this week in Ohio, they found one more innocent person on death row. He was exonerated just this week. But issues of innocence are a problem here in California as well. In California, we have the 3rd highest number of exonerees, the 3rd highest number. And I just want to show you the picture of one. This is Frankie Carillo. Make sure everybody sees his face. Frankie Carillo, at the age of 16, living in Los Angeles, was accused of a homicide he did not commit. But they decided to try Frankie as an adult. And based on the eyewitness testimony of 6 individuals, Frankie Carillo was convicted. He went to state prison. He was there for 19 and a half years before people were able to prove that he was innocent. And I want to tell you that it happened, that proving his innocence happened because our criminal justice system works so well, but that's not Frankie's story. Here's Frankie's story. He's at Folsom State Prison for about 14 years when a teacher really started to believe that he was innocent. And that teacher was about to retire. And she said to Frankie, "This is my last week here. And I promise you, I'm going to find someone to help you." She retired. 6 months later, she's at a dinner talking to a lady by the name of Ellen Agers. Ellen revealed that she was an attorney. And so this retired teacher said, "Let me tell you this story." Well, Ellen happened to be a lawyer at the state public defender's office. So she said, "I'll look at the case." She looked at the case and was convinced that Frankie had been railroaded. So Ellen, being the energetic state public defender and wonderful human being that she is, really went around the state trying to get other people involved in the case. In fact, I didn't know Ellen. And I was walking down the street, and she went running up to me saying, "Aren't you the former warden at San Quentin? I have this guy, and I need help, blah, 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 blah." And I'm like, "Who are you?" And that's how I met Ellen. But Ellen managed to convince some of the innocent projects in the state to help her with Frankie's case. And then they managed to find an LA detective who looked at the case and reenacted the crime and said, "There's no way that anyone saw anything. They're lying." That detective went on to find out who actually committed the murder. The 6 eyewitnesses finally admitted that they had lied. What had happened in that case is the first witness, he was only 16 or 17 years old, and the detective pulled him into a room and said, "You know who did it." And he showed him several pictures, and he said, "You have to pick one of them." And so he picked one, and the detective said, "No, that guy's in jail. It couldn't have been him." He picked another one, and the detective said, "No, he's dead. Try again." And so finally settled on this young face of a young boy riding a bicycle, which was Frankie's picture. And he said, "Yeah, that's him." And then that eyewitness went out and told the other 5 people to pick number 1, which was Frankie Carillo. 19 and a half years later, Frankie walked out of a California prison. So mistakes happen here in this state as well. And then we have those that we now know who are innocent, who have been executed, like Cameron Todd Willingham. He was executed for a fire that killed his 3 daughters. Now arson experts have concluded that the fire was an accident. An accident. They called it fake science. That burden of executing an innocent person is too heavy for anyone to bear. It is not one I want, and I don't think it is one that voters in our state want either. The reason is simple. I care about justice. I care enough about it to have spent a lifetime studying criminal justice. I've thought about it every day since I started in corrections over 34 years ago. I know what works, and I know what doesn't work. And the death penalty, plain and simple, is broken beyond repair. It is a failed public policy that serves no one. We have 34 years of experience. We have data backed by law enforcement leaders and prosecutors, and even 2 Supreme Court justices tell us that. In this state, we have executed 13 people since the death penalty came back into being in 1978. And we have not had an execution since 2006. Most death row inmates will die of old age and have died of old age after decades of appeals paid for by taxpayers like you and I. So we now have 59 death row inmates who've died of old age, another 20 have committed suicide, and another 6 or 7 have died by unknown causes. And the death penalty, inmates who are on death row, they end up with single cells when they're housed at San Quentin State Prison. And so it's really important that you get this point, not because, many of you probably have decided how you feel about the death penalty, but we need you talking to your neighbors and friends and family members about why the death penalty is more expensive than life without possibility of parole. Because most people don't believe that, but it is actually fact. So when you're on death row, you're single-celled. It's more expensive because when you're on death row, you're isolated from the general population. And what does that mean? We're either bringing the services to the death row inmate, or we're bringing the death row inmate to the services. And what does that take? Lots and lots of very expensive staff. And when you're on death row, you have a legal team for life, and lawyers aren't cheap. And all of the investigators and psychiatrists and psychologists that are assigned to these cases are also incredibly expensive. With Prop 34, we have justice that really works. It makes convicted killers work and pay restitution into the victim's compensation fund. Proposition 34 means that they will stay behind bars in prison for the rest of their lives unless they prove themselves innocent, as was the case with another California individual, Obie Anthony. Obie Anthony was sent to state prison with a term of life without possibility of parole out of Los Angeles. After 17 years, he was exonerated. He could have ended up on death row. He could have ended up executed. With life without possibility of parole, he had the opportunity and did prove himself innocent. Right here in California, since 1977, every single person who was justly sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole remains in prison or has died in prison unless they were exonerated, such as Obie Anthony. And that's important because it means that these individuals who are caught for their crimes will be punished without an exorbitant cost to all of us. And that matters a lot to me because I care about savings. Many people think no matter what their position that the death penalty is cheaper than life in prison without possibility of parole. Even when we present the facts, people continue to say that can't be true, but it is true. Life in prison without possibility of parole is cheaper than the death penalty. Now, we have independent reports that bear this out. We have spent $4 billion on the death penalty since 1978. And that's based on an unbiased and comprehensive report by a pro-death penalty federal judge, Arthur Alarcon, and his law professor, his law clerk, who's also a law professor at LMU, Paula Mitchell. Paula Mitchell is opposed to the death penalty. Her boss is in favor of the death penalty. So they said, let's look at this together. They spent 5 years studying the cost of the death penalty. They had access to documents that you and I don't get to see, court costs, things like that. And they concluded that we've spent $4 billion. They also estimate that if we continue with the death penalty in California, we will spend $9 billion by 2030. Their report also states that the death penalty cost us $184 million more per year above the cost of life in prison without the possibility of parole. And then another report by the Nonpartisan Legislative Analyst's Office has also concluded that the state will save at least $130 million a year by replacing the death penalty with life without possibility of parole. And that's because of automatic appeals and constitutionally required double trials and the extra privileges that I described to you that death row inmates get, single celling, the other things that they get. And here's a little bit more detail about how we house death row inmates. They're entitled to visiting 7 days a week because they need to see their lawyers. So they're escorted to the visiting room by 2 correctional officers for each inmate. They're entitled to go to yard 7 days a week for 6 hours a day. That's also a lot of staff taking them to the yard and bringing them back to their cells. Inmates on death row will arrive there with 100 boxes of legal work, and then they have to put numbers on each box. And they can say to the correctional officer, I'm done with box 5, take it away, bring me box 10. There's so much staff involved with housing death row inmates. So by giving them a sentence of life without possibility of parole, they're placed in the general population, and that brings down the cost of incarceration. And the death penalty in the state takes on average of 25 years to bring it to conclusion. And often those cases conclude with the individual receiving a sentence of life without possibility of parole after all of those years of appeals, all of the money we've spent. So and during those 25 years, that means extra lawyers, court costs, and so on, costing the state and local county governments millions of dollars at a time when many counties cannot afford even the basics. In fact, just 3 weeks ago, Los Angeles County announced that they don't have the money to process fingerprints. So they're going to have to prioritize which fingerprints get processed. And one of their policies is, for burglaries, they'll only allow 10 fingerprints a month per precinct. Now, what happens when you stop trying to solve crime? You don't even have to have taken one class in criminal justice to know that when you stop trying to solve crime, what happens? Crime goes up. So When you're making decisions like that, you just have to realize that our criminal justice dollars are so precious and we have to make the right decisions. I'm here as the official proponent of Proposition 34 because I'm a law enforcement professional, I'm a taxpayer, and a mom. I care about my family. We are facing a serious public safety gap in California. 46% of homicides and 56% of reported rapes in California are unsolved on average each year in this state. I would rather direct my tax dollars to solving those crimes and to helping my grandchildren's schools. Like I said, this is personal. Hundreds of murderers and rapists are on our streets because the money to pay for investigations, to apprehend violent criminals, and even prevent violent crime is not there. It's on death row. Prop 34 directs $100 million, which is only a small portion of the savings, to law enforcement for the sole purpose of solving murders and rapes. Again, that's 46% of homicides and 56% of rapes. That's why law enforcement officials have joined me in support of Proposition 34. It's also true that murder cases with African American or Latino victims are less likely to be solved than cases with white or Asian victims. That is what I mean by we have a public safety gap. Murders in communities that are predominantly African American or Spanish speaking are less likely to be solved than murders in predominantly white neighborhoods. In addition, overall people of color are more likely to be wrongfully convicted because of problems like misidentification and ineffective legal representation. We need to replace the death penalty to make sure we never make a grave mistake again. We need to do that for victims. We need to address this public safety gap and make California safe for every family. We need justice that works for everyone. I care about victims. You know, I read hundreds of files during my time at San Quentin, and I've read the most tragic stories that broke my heart, and I think about many of those victims to this day. But I know the death penalty is a burden on family members. The years of appeals, reliving the crime over and over again in the newspapers and in the courtroom is so unfair to these victims' family members. Life without the possibility of parole brings legal closure to these cases. Our focus should be on helping victims of crime. We should remember their names, not the offender who caused them so much pain. Victims understand the death penalty does not work for them. This is why we have the support of so many victims and victims organizations. I want to end tonight by saying just a couple more things, and I want to open it up to questions because I think we'll all learn from your questions. I can't promise what state legislators and local officials and the courts will do with the savings when we pass Proposition 34. But I know that Proposition 34 will give us an opportunity to redirect our resources to what really works to improve public safety. If we keep wasting this money, we won't have it for anyone or anything. We won't have it for public safety, we won't have it for education, or any of the other things that we need to thrive and to keep our families safe, our communities safe, and our children safe. With Prop 34, we can be sure that we will never execute an innocent person. We can stop the waste on lawyers, special housing, and replace the death penalty with life with absolutely no chance of parole. We can have millions of dollars in savings for more DNA tests, better crime labs, and fingerprints analysis. We can do better by all victims by moving closer to solving all rape and murder cases. The best way to prevent crime is to solve it. This time, this election, it is different. It's about our personal safety, our family's safety, our community's safety, and our children's safety. I want to thank you for your time tonight. I want to invite you to join me in voting yes on Proposition 34. I also want to invite you to help. You can help by providing money for our campaign. It's very expensive to run a campaign in the state of California. You can help by volunteering. You can help by hosting house parties where you bring your neighbors in to talk about these issues. We just need you to spread the word because we must win this campaign. So thank you very much.
States recently repealed the death penalty by ballot initiative?
So the question is, have any other states recently repealed the death penalty by ballot initiative? There are only 2 states who have to do it by ballot initiative, and that's California and Oregon. In the last 5 years, 5 states have replaced the death penalty with life without possibility of parole. The last one was Connecticut, just this last year. And so there are now 17 states. California will be the 18th states to replace the death penalty.
My name is Roster, and I'm a mother of a murdered child. I actually volunteered at San Quentin while you were there. What about the cases that currently exist that are death penalty? If we change this, which I hope we do, will they retroactively go back to life without the possibility of parole, or do they have to still fight?
So the question is, what happens to those that are on death row? And what happens to them is they automatically become life without possibility of parole. So let me go here, and then I'll come over there.
To the extent that people on death row have some resources to try and prove their innocence, will any resources be available to those people if the death penalty goes away?
So, I have a couple of answers to that.
Could you repeat the question?
So the question is, to the extent that inmates on death row have resources to try to prove their innocence, will they have those same resources if they have life without possibility of parole? So in this state, if you're convicted of a felony, you're granted 1 appeal at state expense. And that's what you get, is 1 appeal. For non-death penalty cases, those appeals are done in about 18 months. Now, after that, you can continue to appeal if you can afford to do it yourself. You can continue to appeal if you can get one of the Innocence projects interested in your case. You can continue to appeal if you convince a judge that there's evidence of your innocence and that a judge can appoint an attorney. But that's what you're given. Now, I think what people think about the death penalty, I hate when I get a tickle in my throat when I'm trying to talk. But most of what happens in death penalty cases has little to do with guilt or innocence. It has a lot to do with procedural kind of issues. And that's why on death rows across the country, people have been on death row for 26, 27 years before they're able to prove their innocence. And generally it comes from an Innocence project getting involved.
My position is the moral issue of a state killing an individual. I cannot identify with a state killing an individual any more than I can identify with an individual killing an individual. I don't really care about the money. I don't care about the politics. I just am going to support this proposition because for years I could never justify identifying with a state that commits murder.
And, I speak about this issue as a former warden, as a person who's very interested in criminal justice public policy for the state of California. And that's the position I take. But I'm going to be very clear. I've always been morally opposed to the death penalty, but that's not what makes me passionate about it. What makes me passionate about it is my experience with it and understanding how precious our criminal justice dollars are, and that we need to use those dollars in a way that makes sense, not on something so wasteful, ineffective. The death penalty doesn't deter crime. It doesn't do anything to make us safer. I'll make this last comment, and then I'll get to more questions. At the end of every execution, someone on my staff would say, "Are we safer tonight because of what we did?" And we would just look at each other. We knew the answer was no. There's nothing we could have done. That execution solved nothing for anyone. Yes.
One fact that astounded me was how few countries in the world have a death penalty. And I would like you to maybe talk a little bit about which countries still have it, because I think that's a really important selling point to the average citizen when they realize that most countries in the world don't execute people. And I really would like to see that information as part of your campaign. I think it's really powerful.
So you would think that, but we've done lots of polling. And there's something odd about people in California that think that we are not a part of the rest of the world. And so moral issues don't work. The fact that so few countries still have the death penalty doesn't work. And I'm telling you this because if you're going to help us win, it has to be about the facts, the money, and the fact that we could execute an innocent person, because our polling shows that that's what resonates with voters. And you know, we're in the company of countries like Iraq, Iran, Pakistan. I mean, none of you can't even be a part of the European nation and have the death penalty. But again, that fact does not resonate with voters. Let me jump back over here. Go ahead, right here. And then, oh, okay, both of you, one and then the other. Go ahead.
I'm just curious what the pro-arguments are. It's so clear that this is a failed policy, so what are you battling?
So I guess it's time to talk about who our opponents are. Our opponents are the District Attorneys Association. While we do have one DA who's been brave enough to come out and support us, that's George Gascon in San Francisco. And you know, George Gascon, he's a law and order kind of guy. And he's the former chief of police in San Francisco, in a city in Arizona, and then he was deputy chief in Los Angeles. So this is a law and order kind of guy, and he understands that our money can be better utilized in other ways. The Sheriff's Association is also in opposition to us. We have a couple of sheriffs who are considering coming out in support of us, but we're waiting to hear from them. And then the Police Chiefs Association is also in opposition to us. We do have the police chief of Palo Alto who's come out in support of our initiative, and we have several other police chiefs who are considering it. But it's a very difficult thing to do. And the prison guards are saying this is not their issue. They're saying it's not their issue. And I'm so proud of the California Correctional Peace Officers Association. I mean, they're saying this is not about us. And, you know, it's their staff that carry this out. And the staff at San Quentin, I mean, I really pointed this out to the union. You know, your staff are Catholic, Jewish, many other religions, and many of them don't believe this is the right thing. So, you know, please don't think of the staff at San Quentin as being pro-death penalty. You'll find more anti-death penalty people working at San Quentin because they understand this issue up close and personal. They know how much it costs. They know the years that people sit there on death row. And all the other things that we've talked about. And so the opposition argument is this, that we're lying about the cost. Well, it's not true. It's not our reports. These are independent reports. That we can fix it. We just need to make it quicker. Okay? In states where it's quicker, it's still 15 plus years, and it's growing, and they've executed innocent people. I don't think that that's what we want to do. And to make it quicker, these same commissions that studied the death penalty, the Commission on the Fair Administration of Justice, concluded we would need to spend $100 million more a year to make it quicker. That's more courtrooms, more judges, more attorneys. And we just don't have that kind of money. So that's the argument. Okay, and the lady right behind you.
I'm just curious because I'm trying to take it back because you talked about exoneration rates and things like that. I'm just curious, number one, what you thought about whether DNA technology has helped at all in who is getting put on death row. And also, to me, I don't know what you think, but I think we have a serious failure of our jury systems because of societal issues. So I have two questions. One, the power of the DNA, and the other, what you thought about whether we should reform juries and that kind of thing too.
So with DNA is only available in less than 20% of homicide cases. So what you see on TV just ain't so. It just isn't happening that way. But what DNA has taught us in law enforcement is this, not to believe everything we think. So we now know that eyewitness testimony is horrible. We now know that people will falsely confess to crimes, particularly if they're young or if they're developmentally disabled. We now know, I think we always knew this, but we lied to ourselves, that jailhouse snitches lie 125% of the time. But we've learned that because of DNA, which has caused many people across the country to question the use of a penalty like the death penalty. because we're finding so many innocent people. What was the second part?
The second one was about jury.
Jury. Well, you know, in this state, to be on a to be on a jury that's a death penalty case, you have to believe in the death penalty. And so that, what does that do? What does that do? I mean, it throws out lots of people, and lots of people of color, because people of color are more apt to be opposed to the death penalty. So let me jump way over here, and I will stay until I answer all your questions if you stay. So.
You said that all the prosecutors are against your proposition. Is it because it gives them leverage in plea bargaining?
Well, it's the DA's association. So we know that there are DAs who don't use the death penalty, because even in this state, there's only about 10 counties that continue to go after the death penalty. So geography will tell you whether you're even going to be considered for the death penalty. So not every DA believes in it. But we actually had a DA get up in front of the legislature and say, it will hurt us with plea bargaining. And then John Van de Kamp, the former Attorney General of California, got up there and said, that is unethical. That is unethical. You can't overcharge just to get somebody to plead guilty to a crime. So, you know, it's inappropriate, and that shouldn't be a reason. But in states who don't have the death penalty, they don't find that plea bargaining is any more difficult. There's been studies on that as well. Yeah. Wait, okay. Go ahead. Either one of you. I'll answer both.
I was curious about the response to people that say, well, somebody's already life without parole or on the death row, they have no incentive to behave. In other words, you know, what else can you do to them? So I'm wondering if the death penalty has any role in inmate conduct.
So does the death penalty have any role in helping with inmate conduct inside the prison system? Does it make staff safer, other inmates safer? I'm adding on to your question. So my answer to that is no. I mean, what we have to do in the Department of Corrections, and we do very well in this state, is classify inmates and put them in the appropriate housing that is decided by both their crime and their behavior. And so what also happens in the Department of Corrections is the better behaved you are, the greater privileges you get, and the better your situation is. Now, when this prison system was so overcrowded, that second part that I just talked about, you know, getting greater privileges and better housing because you behave better, wasn't happening because we didn't have any room to put anybody anywhere. But now that the prison population is coming down and the department has more flexibility, inmates who behave and do what they're supposed to do and work hard and go to school and go to work and all the things that we ask them to do are actually being classified to the right setting. And those inmates who need higher housing are being classified to that kind of housing. So it's incumbent upon us as professionals to put people in the right setting to make sure that our staff and other inmates are safe. Okay, I don't know where to go next, so how about right here?
As has been previously stated, I too am morally against the death penalty. So to me, to that extent, it's a no-brainer. Yes, I'm 36.
34.
34. But I'm in touch with a lot of people who are in prison, and I'm hearing pretty consistently that the guys on death row, a lot of them are against the initiative.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any idea why that might be the case? Are against the initiative?
So there are individuals on death row who are against the initiative. Well, you know, when I was the warden at San Quentin State Prison, I met every newly arrived death row inmate on a process we call classification. And during that time, the 5 years I was warden, I had 3 inmates who arrived there with the death penalty who asked for it, who asked for the death penalty. And you may say, why? Well, they said it's better prison time. You get a single cell, you get a legal team for life. That legal team tends to adopt you. That legal team makes sure you get Christmas cards. That legal team makes sure that you get visits. That legal team is someone you can call when you pick up that telephone. And so for many individuals who are on death row, they think that they'll never be executed, so why not just sit there in death row? The problem is we're spending millions, billions of dollars on that process and that system. And, you know, for me, it's really not about the inmates on death row. I mean, I need to be very clear about that. It's about justice, what works, and what is the right thing to do.
First of all, thank you. That was really interesting, really compelling. And actually, my question has to do with sort of a sidelight that you brought up earlier about the people who have to witness the executions and all that. And I was just wondering, if you're a staff member there, are you allowed to say you don't want to do that? How do you pick the people that have to do that?
So how do you pick the people who are involved in the execution process? Well, they volunteer, but I will tell you that many people who volunteer, they didn't volunteer because they wanted to execute someone. They generally volunteer because they had a respect for who the warden was. And they wanted to support the warden and support the laws of the state of California. But I can tell you it has an impact on them. I mean, I've talked to wardens all across this country, and they say the same thing, is that it will live with you for the rest of your life, being involved in an execution. Yes. Let me jump to the gentleman right there, and then I'll come this way. Go ahead. And I'll get back to you. You had your hand up a long time. Go ahead.
I accept all your economic arguments. They're very compelling, and that makes an economic case. The issue that's troubling me is there any crime that deserves the death penalty? Is it possible to have a crime so egregious that that's really the only fair and equitable solution? I was astonished to hear that a fellow in Norway who killed, I don't know, 43 children, or whatever it was.
It was more than that. Yes.
Whatever it was, a huge number. Suppose, I'm hypothecating here. Suppose the individual admits their guilt and says, I did that, I'm sane, I'm not insane, I deserve to be executed, I want to be executed. Is there any crime that is so bad and horrible, domestic terrorism, international, I don't care what it is, that the death penalty is warranted and should be administered?
So, I guess individuals have to answer that question, but I always quote Bryan Stevenson when I'm asked that question, and Bryan Stevenson says, the question isn't whether they deserve to die, it's whether we deserve to kill. And I don't know a better answer for that. I mean, the crimes that people are sitting on death row for here at San Quentin are some really horrific crimes. But when you think about the fact that those death row inmates will be there for so many years, sitting in a single cell with a legal team that's taking care of them, I mean, is that really the kind of justice that people envision? And then we promise these victims' family members that an execution is going to happen, and rarely is it going to happen. And then if it does happen, it's 25 or 30 years after the crime. And there isn't, everybody who's tried to fix this system has made it longer. So to me, life without possibility of parole is a very harsh punishment. Talk to anyone who's spent 25 years in prison or longer. It's a very harsh punishment. And individuals will be forgotten when they are serving that term. And to me, for people who commit these horrific crimes, that's the right answer. And I know, I can see by your face that I haven't answered that, but that's the best I have, and I absolutely believe it. I mean, I know that I've seen individuals serving life without possibility of parole, of which we have almost 4,000 in the state. And many of them, they earn privileges by trying to work and do the things they're supposed to do, and those who don't end up at Pelican Bay, and to me, I'm just fine with that. So way in the back.
Yeah. When I was in law school, my criminal law professor told me there were 3 reasons for capital punishment. One was deterrence. The other was isolation. You remove the person from society so they couldn't do it again. And the third was, and this was kind of surprising to me, was socialized revenge. And so your idea of life without possibility of parole answers the first 2, but the third one, revenge, is kind of, I'm not sure that life without possibility of parole answers that. And I ask you to think of that in terms of the guy who killed Polly Klaas. Here's a guy who's been there for, 15, 20 years. He's sitting on death row. He'll probably never be executed. And, my feeling about that was, the societal revenge aspect of that was never fulfilled. And somehow that has got to be part of the equation when you're talking about abolishing capital punishment. You have to persuade people that somehow either that is not ever going to be fulfilled under our existing system, or it's going to be fulfilled because these people are punished in a way that is taken care of.
So, lots of people have talked to lots of victims. In fact, my own organization has California Crime Victims for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. And we have almost 800 members. And who belongs to that organization? Well, there's people who belong to that organization who initially wanted the death penalty and have someone sitting on death row here, and then came to realize that the burden was on them. And they got tired of hearing the offender's name in the newspaper over and over again, and they were forgotten. Also in that group are individuals who have lost a loved one to a homicide, and we don't know who did it. They've never gotten an answer, and they want the money spent on that. And then also in that group, there's a mother whose son was a police officer who was killed. And the person who killed her son is on death row, and every Christmas she sends him a card and says, "Merry Christmas. I'm glad you're still alive. I hope you live to be 100 in that small cell at San Quentin. Don't you die on me." And so, you know, there's all kinds of perspectives about this. But the one thing that we've heard over and over from talking to victims group, the punishment they want for the person who offended them is the harshest punishment available. And if that's life without possibility of parole, they're fine with that. And then it brings legal closure, and they can, I mean, these are horrific crimes. How people move on is very, very difficult. But at least they don't have to worry about going to court or reading about it in the newspaper. That part of it is done. And so that's the only answer I can give. I understand that people want more than that. I mean, if someone killed someone I loved, I'm sure that would be my reaction at first. That's the only answer I can give. Back here, and then I'll go way back there.
You said that the prison population is going down. Why is that?
Oh, this is such a long, complicated answer. The prison population is going down, and well, the reason it's going down is that the U.S. Supreme Court decided that, well, you had a lawsuit in the state of California about health care, and part of the lawsuit contended that we could not provide constitutionally required health care to inmates in prison because we were too overcrowded to do so. The U.S. Supreme Court agreed with that. I agree with that, because when you build prisons for 3,000 inmates like San Quentin, and then at my high point I house 6,200 inmates, you can't do anything you're supposed to do. And that's hard on staff and inmates and everybody involved, and it's, you know, it's just a lot to go into. So why is it going down? The U.S. Supreme Court agreed with the lower court that California had to reduce its prison population. So your governor, Jerry Brown, implemented what we had been pushing for a very long time, something called a realignment. And what that means is non-serious, non-violent offenders are not sent to state prison, they're kept locally. And just to give you an example, and then I'll move on to why I'm here tonight. In 2009, 47,000 people went to state prison for 90 days or less. 90 days or less. I would parole people at San Quentin the day they arrived, or a week after they arrived. Now you would think, well, that's absurd. I called it the longest, most expensive bus ride to nowhere. Because when an individual arrives at state prison, we give them a TB test, a full physical. We give them a psychological exam. If there's any evidence of mental illness, they're seen by a psychiatrist for an even greater exam. 25% of the population is mentally ill. We test them for developmental disabilities. We determine whether they have physical disabilities, and then we parole them without doing anything with the information for that 47,000 people. Think of how much money was wasted. That money is now being sent to the local communities to figure out what to do to alternatives to incarceration. More drug treatment, electronic monitoring, day reporting centers, doing community corrections, which is what they have done in other states like New York, where they managed to close 3 prisons while reducing their crime rate. So it's a great step for California. We have a lot to learn and a long way to go, but that's why the prison population is going down. Right here. Then I promise back there.
Is life without parole a harsher sentence, in your opinion, than death penalty? I mean, what is a day like on death row? What does Scott Peterson do day in and day out?
So life on death row, for the majority of death row inmates, those who are well behaved and follow the rules, is either sitting in your cell watching TV, doing your legal work, writing letters, reading letters, or going to the visiting room and visiting, or going to the exercise yard and exercising. When you're on death row, just a handful of death row inmates have jobs, less than 1%. So none of them work. If you're life without possibility of parole, you're required to work 5 days a week, 6 hours a day. And a portion of your salary that you get will go to the Victims Restitution Fund. Now you think, what work do we do in prison? Well, anybody who drove a car here tonight has a souvenir from a prison, your license plate. If you have paid your license fees, you have the license tag, also made by inmates. But in addition to that, all the glasses for Medi-Cal, for all Medi-Cal people in the state of California, are made by inmates. All the school furniture in your children's schools. I took my son away to San Diego State University to go to college last year, and when I looked in his room, I was proud to find that their dorm furniture was made by inmates, and I knew it would hold up to those guys that were going to live in that dorm, and sure enough it did. And so, you know, you can do some good, and most inmates do. I mean, they can earn privileges and work and give back to our society in some way, and most inmates are very proud to do that, particularly as they age, as they get older. I mean, I'm not going to tell you when they come in at 18 that they're eager to do these things, but by the time they're 25, 26, they are looking for ways to give back to society in some way. Way back there were hands. Right there. Yeah. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
I just wanted to better understand, maybe you can help me better understand the fiscal or economic benefit, if there is, of Prop 34 or not. You mentioned $100 million of savings. Is that on an annual basis? And are there provisions that guarantee, if we vote on Prop 34 or Prop 34 passes, are there provisions that guarantee that the money that we save from ending the death penalty stays within law enforcement and it's channeled appropriately? Because we're in obviously California's in a very tough fiscal crisis, and money gets moved around a lot for this and that, rob Peter, pay Paul, and that kind of thing. So from that aspect, can you help us better understand it?
Okay, so the Legislative Analyst's Office says we will save at least $130 million a year. And where does that, most of that money comes from laying off defense attorneys and reducing the cost of incarceration. So as an example, we spend $36 million a year just on defense attorneys. So what our initiative does, Proposition 34, for 3 years, it sets aside $100 million in total. So it's actually $10 million the first 6 months after the win, and then $30 million for the next 3 years for the sole purpose of solving unsolved homicides and unsolved rapes. Now you say, why only 3 years? Well, our focus, we met with lots of victims and asked what they wanted. They wanted people to know that there's so much unsolved crime in California. So we're focusing that. And they wanted for a time money to be spent on that, and hopefully communities, the legislature, local people would understand how important it is to continue that money. And why not more than 3 years? Well, other initiatives, when we looked at other initiatives, it said this money is going to schools forever. What happens after 3 or 4 years? The legislature stops giving the money to schools. So our initiative is very realistic. 3 years, let's see what good we can do in California, and then our public policy will follow the outcomes of that. Way back there.
You may have answered my question somewhat, but can you give me an example of death row inmates? Do they not use the improvement programs that you have offered to them as much as lifetime sentencees? And if so, could you chronicle a couple stories to depict a death row inmate versus one who's there for life, and how they use your improvement programs?
Well, the improvement programs really aren't very much available to inmates on death row. I mean, there is a teacher available to them, but that's really about it. A little bit of arts and corrections kind of stuff is given to inmates on death row. So, you know, because most of that is provided by volunteers at San Quentin, so it's given to the general population just because of the nature of where death row is. It's isolated from the general population. So I really don't know if there were many more programs, whether they'd participate in them or not. So I can't really answer that question. Now, inmates who are serving life sentences, all across the state are, when there's programs available, they really seek them out and really try to participate in them, and we certainly found that at San Quentin with the many programs that are available there. But you know, San Quentin has far more programs than any other prison in the state. It has 3,000 volunteers a year. You just don't see that at other prisons. Yes?
Yeah, thanks. So it's clear, and I agree, that the death penalty doesn't work. And some people would argue that there are many things about our criminal justice system that don't work. And you touched on this a little bit with talking about overcrowding, but I was just wondering if you could talk about whether or not you think there are other things in the criminal justice system that need, you know, these kind of movements around them, and if so, what they are, or if you think that the death penalty is sort of like the primary flaw in our criminal justice system that we should, you know, be primarily focused on.
Well, you know, I'm passionate about replacing the death penalty because it costs so much money, but there's certainly other things in our criminal justice system that need to be fixed. The Commission on the Fair Administration of Justice identified our problems with how we use eyewitness testimony as an example, and efforts to reform that have not made it through the legislature, or when they did, were not signed by the governor. But just this last year, Governor Brown did sign one piece of legislation that says you can no longer use jailhouse snitches absent other evidence. So that's one thing that was reformed. And you know, and I want to make it clear, I'm passionate about these reforms because if you have the wrong guy in prison, who isn't in prison? The guy who did it. And you know, we really have to have processes in place that make sure our police are finding the right people and using the right evidence to be sure that we have the person who actually did it. I mean, we found in looking at cases in other states, Michael Morton, any of you see him on 60 Minutes? He was exonerated after 26 years. I mean, and the DA in that case hid the evidence that showed he didn't do it, right? And as a result, the person who killed his wife was a serial killer and went on to kill another person before he was found. If they had processed the DNA that was at the site, at the scene, he would have been caught before he killed that second woman.
What state was that?
That was Texas, yeah. The DA is actually, it's one of the, he's now a judge, but they are actually, they actually have a panel in place to look at whether he should be prosecuted. So they're looking at that. You know, Texas has had so many exonerees that they really have passed, put a lot more provisions in place than California has as a result of their bad history, quite honestly. You know, just as a side note, I'll tell you this. If you're exonerated in Texas, by your 45th day out of custody, they give you a check for $80,000 for every year you were incarcerated, followed by a check of $80,000 annually times the number of years you were incarcerated. They give you free health care for life, and if you want to go to college free, they give you that too, because they had so many exonerees who were ending up homeless and on the streets. That's how far Texas has come in trying to clean up their act. I'll come over here. Yes?
In the long run,
No, you, and then I'll go back.
in the long run, is this likely to lead to the requirement of building more prisons?
You know, I don't think so, because keep in mind that inmates on death row are single celled. So when they go to general populations, they'll be double celled. And that actually will open up space where they're single celled now for more inmates. So it actually would increase the capacity for level 2 inmates at San Quentin. So yes, we won't be building more prisons, I don't think. Way in the back, and then I'll come this way. So many hands up.
I'm struggling with the vision of Richard Allen, whatever his name was, like class, in an improvement program playing basketball with the general population. At the same time, Steve McQueen and Papillon on his island is way over here. Has there been any sort of thought of having some sort of level of incarceration where they're not mixing with the general population, but these are really bad guys, and I don't think they're really entitled to what the general population is getting. So would there be like a super prison or some sort of layer that these folks can be put?
So,
it is truly punishment.
So prison is behavioral based, and it really needs to be, or they wouldn't be. Couldn't have enough staff inside a prison. If you behave appropriately, you get privileges. If you don't, you end up at Pelican Bay or Corcoran.
That's the problem I'm having. Is the guy all of a sudden says, "I repent," and
it's not.
all his crimes are forgiven, he becomes general population.
No, you have to earn that, and you have to continue to earn it. You have to go to work 5 days a week, 6 hours a day. You have to abide by the rules of the prison. So at least you're held accountable and you're required to work instead of laying in your bunk, watching TV, going to the exercise yard, which is what's happening on death row today. And so, you know, for those inmates who abide by the rules, I mean, it's really the only way you can manage a prison is to make it incentive-based. Behave and you get a few privileges, don't behave and those are all taken away from you. And so I understand your point, but it would be so hard to manage prisons. You couldn't have enough staff in these prisons. It's an operational, yes. Mm-hmm.
Would this be a good time to describe what Pelican Bay is like?
Pelican Bay, if you're in security housing unit at Pelican Bay, you're in your cell 23 hours a day, so you're only out 1 hour a day, and you're not ever really taken to an outside exercise yard. The yard is within the unit. It has like a skylight. You have very little contact with staff, if any. If you're in one of the mental health programs, you're out about 10 hours a week in therapies of different types, but that's about it. It's a pretty stark existence. Yes, you can see lawyers. The Department of Corrections can never stop you from seeing lawyers. At Pelican Bay, it's behind the glass, though it's not in person, except in rare circumstances where a lawyer might get a court order to see them in person. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's very harsh. This lady back here, and then I'll move up and I'll
follow that gentleman's talk about not needing ward prisons. Every few years we hear that San Quentin has to be enlarged to house the death penalty, the death row. And one very good outcome, if this passes, is that we wouldn't hear that anymore.
You wouldn't hear that ever again. And, because the penal code in the state of California says if you're sentenced to death and you're male, you will be housed at San Quentin State Prison. And, if that death row continues to grow, I argued for a new death row because it's too big. And it needs to be, death row inmates need to be housed in a modern, maximum security prison, and San Quentin isn't that. And so, yes, we would have to build a new death row if we do not pass this initiative, but we're going to pass yes on 34. Gentlemen, and then you? Yeah, back here and then you.
So as far as the budget is concerned, the economic argument is concerned, you said $136 million?
The Legislative Analyst's Office has said $130 million a year.
So to give that number some perspective relative to the state's budget, I did a Google thing earlier today, and in 1980, 4% of the state budget was spent in the prison system, and now it's around 11 or 12%, I believe
11%, yeah.
And higher education went from 12 to 7, something like that. So clearly there's two stark graphs that are going on. So put the $136 million in context relative to the state budget, what percent of the total spending in the prison system would be saved as a result of this initiative?
So I don't do...
136 is a number.
Yeah,
I mean, is it against billions or what's...
Well, the Department of Corrections budget is somewhere around, when I left, we had a lot more inmates than we do today. Thank goodness the population has dropped. So I think their budget is about $8 billion now.
So less than 1%?
It's going to be less than 1%, but the savings isn't just to the state. The savings is to you locally. So when you have a death penalty case, just to give you an example, in LA, a death penalty case takes about 800 days. Life without possibility of parole case takes about 400 days. 25 to life case takes about 200 days. During that 800 days, that person sitting in your county jail, you're paying for that person to be there. During that 800 days, you're paying for their lawyer and their entire legal team. So the savings are much more locally. It will be felt much more locally. And one of the individuals who's in favor of our initiative, Yes on 34, is Ron Briggs. Now his father is Mr. Briggs, Senator Briggs, who put the initiative on the ballot in 1978. He's the reason we have the death penalty today. So Ron Briggs is a Republican, he's conservative, but he's also on the Board of Supervisors in El Dorado County. And he says when the DA comes to him and says, I need $1 million for a death penalty case, what they have to do is look at what they're going to cut to give the DA that money. That's the kind of decisions that are being made locally. So, a savings of $130 million maybe doesn't sound like a lot when you put it in the context of the entire state budget, but when you look at local communities, it's a lot of money that can be saved as a result of passing Yes on 34. And the Legislative Analyst's Office didn't take into consideration those local savings. They just looked at the state savings. Yes?
Two questions. One is context. You said in the beginning that 100 innocent people they have proved were incorrectly given the death penalty.
Over
100, yes.
Okay, over 100, but in the context of how many people on death row. And
So-
then the second
okay.
question, if I may, is you had said that if they're on life, that they have a longer opportunity to appeal their case. But in actuality, they actually have less dollars to do so. Am I understanding that correctly?
So let me start with that one first and then talk about how many people on death row. So if you have a life term, you get one appeal at taxpayers' expense. And then it's on you to either prove to a judge that there's evidence of your innocence to get an attorney, or you have to pay for it yourself, or you have to reach out to one of the Innocence projects. That's true. If you're on death row, you do have that legal team for life. But that legal team really is there for lots of procedural reasons. More so.
Point is that if you're on life, you don't have that same opportunity to free legal advice. So the chances of you being incorrectly sentenced and not dealt with correctly may be higher. I don't know.
Yeah, there's not been studies done of that. I mean, they're finding innocent people on and off death rows all over the country because innocence projects are as a result of DNA and other things are working on these cases where there's innocence. But what it will also do to end the death penalty is free up court time. I mean, almost 30% of the California Supreme Court time is spent on death penalty cases. I've talked to judges who said, this will free up a lot more time for us to do a better job with these cases. So that and fixing some of the procedural things that are broken, like with eyewitness testimony, will get us to where we need to be to ensure that we're not putting innocent people in prison. We have a lot of work to do, I agree.
And then the first one was 100 plus
Okay.
content.
So over 100 people have been found innocent on death rows across the country, and I think the number is actually 126, but maybe even larger than that. But here's what Bryan Stevenson, I don't know if you know who he is. He's a very famous attorney who's argued several cases before the U.S. Supreme Court and won, including the case that says you can't execute juveniles. But this is what he says about that. For every 9 people that have been executed in the United States, we have found an innocent person. He said, if you took off on a plane today and that you knew for every 9 planes that took off, one was going to fall out of the sky, would you still fly?
But how many people are on death row nationwide?
Yeah, so we're the largest death row in the country, and I just don't remember the number, but I think it's close to 3,000. But you can Google that, and it'll come right up. The number's not coming into my brain, but I do think it's close to 3,000. Yes, and then I'll come back over here.
Can I have an opportunity to work at the DBI, at the prison in Briggs and Tascadero? My question is, if it seems like there's 700 something at San Quentin on death row, I heard stories it was like a 6th floor or something because there's no room in the house. The fellas there. Basically, it's an indefinite sentence. It's not because it's like they can argue First Amendment, you're violating my religious freedom. I want to donate my body parts or something. I read some book or something. They challenged it. That's not true story. But my church folks are told against the death penalty. With me, I don't understand all this number stuff. I didn't really know what would help me. Be more for it. What we vote for is the moral issue or something. Because I'm going to have to my grandson, I'd be pretty upset. And he's not allowed to see his father, who's a heroin addict. His daughter doesn't know. He's grown up enough to know right from wrong. I don't know. I just have mixed feelings there. So I'm not really. I can't really make a stand. I like to get some more. Besides this stuff.
Well, the moral issue is we have to leave that up to each of you in the room to decide what your morals are on this topic. What we talk about are the facts, and for me, the facts speak for themselves. It costs way too much money. It's broken beyond repair. We're spending billions of dollars on a punishment that isn't going to happen. The DA of San Diego, very conservative, staunch Republican, says it's a hollow promise to victims. It truly doesn't work. And so that's what I have to talk about, because for me, it is the facts.
So if I can understand the numbers of your proposition, you say 130 million
per year.
And you take 100 million of that and put it back toward prosecuting rapes and other crimes, etc.
We save 130 million a year, and we take, for the first 6 months, 10 million. For the next 3 years, $30 million a year, for a total of 100 million over the 3.5 years. So there's still substantial savings. And again, that number doesn't capture the local savings that I talked about. Yes. So our polling. So when we read them the ballot language, 52% of the voters say it's time to replace the death penalty with life without possibility of parole. When we give them the information that I've been talking about all night, then we get as high as 57%. That's why it's so important for us to get our ads on TV, and they cost a lot of money. It's so important for me and others like you to meet with people who are going to vote on this issue so that they understand that life without possibility of parole is far cheaper than the death penalty, because that's what resonates with voters today, and the issue of innocence. Way in the back.
Yes, this is a little off topic, but maybe you can give a little historical perspective as to why, to a newcomer to this state, relative newcomer, why someone like Charles Manson or Sirhan Sirhan is still going through the appeals, the parole process. What, I read about this and I just really don't quite understand.
That's a great question. So that's a great question. So when the U.S. Supreme Court declared that the death penalty was unconstitutional in 1977, I believe it was, Charles Manson was on death row at San Quentin along with Sirhan Sirhan and a whole bunch of other people. At that time, life without possibility of parole was not an available punishment in this state. It wasn't on our books. So when their sentences were overturned, they automatically became what we call a 7-up lifer. That meant 7 to life. That means that they're entitled to go to the parole board. It used to be annually, to be considered for parole after serving 7 years. But a few years ago, there was an initiative on the ballot where the voters voted that that 1 year could be extended to 15 years. So now they can be denied parole for up to 15 years, from 1 year up to 15 years. But at the end of 15 years, they get to go before the parole board again. But Charlie Manson will never get out. Charlie Manson will, I'm sure, die in prison. But that's why it's a great question, because when we say to people, life without possibility of parole, they bring up that very same thing. Oh, there's no such thing, Charlie Manson. But they're different punishments.
Can you talk about how the death penalty affects the composition of prison gangs, and whether it makes a difference with regard to, like, the Aryan Nation and some of these other gangs within prison? I mean, is that a factor in how they behave, or do they?
For death row? Yeah, there are some gang members on death row, but it's a very small percent of the population. And, in prison, gangs have a great influence over people's behavior. And it's that group on death row that would likely end up at Pelican Bay or Corcoran when we win this initiative. But it's a very small percent. Yes, the lady in the back, and then I'll come up here.
Yes, I'm just reading a very interesting book. It's called Torture in the United States by Marjorie Cohen. She also says that many of our prisoners are being shipped outside of the country for torture, so that we could claim we do not torture. But she has a lot of reasons and proof that we do torture in this country. Have you heard any of that?
So the question for everybody is, she's reading a book called Torture in the United States. And, I don't know anything about that. It's not something that happens in California prisons. I think that has a lot more to do with terrorism and how that's been addressed by the United States, but I don't really know anything about it. Yes?
You, having been there, do you see these guys, and again, I'm talking about the extreme bad guys, mixing with the general population, and how will the general population receive them? I mean, isn't there sort of a little code within a code there that's going to show these guys being who they are and no longer protected by their status? And they've been able to repent and elevate themselves into the, routine. Then what?
So, the question is, when they leave death row and end up with life without possibility of parole, won't the inmate code kind of handle it, I guess, or do something to them? And the answer to that is, that's really in movies, and it used to be in correctional systems, but now we do a great job of classifying inmates. We have more modern prisons where there's smaller yards. So we have what we call sensitive needs yards. So there's many inmates like the guys on death row. In fact, we've had over 100 inmates' sentences overturned, and they were given life without possibility of parole. So they assimilate into these general populations where they'll be safe. And so that's all addressed by the Department of Corrections. Safety concerns are, have to be what we respond to. You can make it out to yes, I'm 34, or to SAFE, S-A-F-E. S-A-F-E. And we have information out, I think, at the tables. Is it out at the tables? And there's actually envelopes there where you can mail in your contribution or give it to, where is it? Right back there. Back there somewhere. Okay. Yes, so if you go to the SAFE, or Yes on 34, or SAFE, to the website, there's a calendar that tells you where we're going to be. And if you have speaking opportunities, I'm happy to show up, or we'll send someone from the campaign to talk. We have lots of people who are out there talking to groups like this tonight. Way in the back, and then I'll come here. Okay.
Do you have any sense of what will happen to those prisoners now who didn't deserve the ultimate sentence and got life without?
How they're doing?
No, what would happen to them? For example, the wives and girlfriends of people who ended up in San Quentin on death row. They get life without, but they didn't deserve it. Now people who commit the crime go down to life without.
So I don't think I'm understanding the question, so try it one more time for me.
The question is, when people are sentenced to a lesser sentence than the ultimate, they're given life without because they don't deserve a lesser sentence. What happens to them now when they see people who did commit bad crimes get the same sentence as them?
Well, so the way the law works, to get life without or the death penalty, there's a list of crimes. Those crimes are the same. So in one county, you could get life without possibility of parole. A crime committed that's exactly the same, you could end up with the death penalty in another county. Remember, San Francisco County has no one on death row. So you commit a crime in San Francisco that's equivalent to a crime in LA, and you're not going to end up on death row, but the guy in LA did. So we have 58 counties practicing 58 different ways of criminal justice. So if your issue is it fair and equal? The answer is no. It's not fair and equal now. If you commit a crime in San Bernardino County, you're going to get the harshest punishment you can get, and you're not going to get that same punishment in Alameda. So that's just, the way our laws are. Yes.
I have been
then to you, I'm sorry.
Struck at understanding why you couched the argument relative to costs. And it's very compelling. On the other hand, the argument is not, here at least, addressing the moral issues and the impact on society when they are a society that wants to punish and exact revenge, and how those things don't work. You've talked about it, it was reflected, I inferred it, when you talk about the sheriffs and the DAs and those people whose rice bowl is putting people away. And they believe it, some of them, that it's the right thing to do. But every time somebody is put to death, there is the matter of innocence, but there is also the value that gets reified in our society, which is that we take lives. And someone's telling me deterrence. I don't think it works that way because I think crimes are mostly caused by damaged people who have poor impulse control. So I guess that's an observation, and if you want to comment on it, because you must have some values along these lines, and you're doing a good job of keeping them separate.
I try not to judge people, and how they think about these issues, because when I talk to people who believe in the death penalty, I hear them say things like, the victim's family deserves that. So their concern is for the victim's family. And I hear other people saying there's just some crimes that are so horrible that you have to have that punishment. But when you give them the facts and they come to realize that the death penalty just doesn't work, I mean, it just doesn't work and it costs so much money, then they get to the point. And when you talk about what has happened to victims who thought they wanted the death penalty, then people start to realize that the right answer is to replace the death penalty.
And the effect of forgiveness. Anybody who forgives is healing themselves.
Yes, I think that that's true for many people. But again, I would never pretend to tell victims how to feel. I mean, these crimes are really horrific crimes. Yes?
I understand that a lot of your argument is based on double selling people. And yet I understand there's really no motivation for the state to have to put people into double cells once this initiative passes. Can you comment on that?
Well, all inmates in the state of California are expected to double cell if they're in the general population. And there's rare exceptions if somebody has a history of in-cell violence or in-cell predatory behavior, then they're not required to. But other than that, they're expected to double cell, and if they don't, then they can lose privileges and they can be sent to a higher custody prison.
So all these people would move into double cell?
For the most part. I mean, there certainly are some that would end up at Pelican Bay, and most of the Pelican Bay inmates are single cell. There's still some at Pelican Bay that are double cell though, too.
I totally support your position, so I just said the one thing I wanted to point out that's not clear to me, that seems very weak, is you said if they're with no possibility of parole, they only have access to one appeal.
That's daily expense.
But then you had this weird, but maybe I misheard it, unless they can show that there's some evidence or something like that. Isn't that pretty much getting all the other appeals? I mean, how much is that shut down?
Yeah.
Because otherwise your money argument goes out the window.
It's a very high standard. So, the kind of cases would be an O.B. Anthony case where they found DNA that was never processed. And so a court allowed that case to go forward and said, we got to process the DNA. And, it's cases like that. It's very unusual for a judge to, after the first appeal, to reopen the case on issues of innocence. Now, if you had, like in Frankie's case, where you have all the eyewitnesses say we lied, well, that's the kind of cases that get judges to reopen them.
But how many times do they get to try? I know they won't maybe reopen, but how many tries are
They get one try at taxpayer expense. After that, it's on them. It's their expense. So you're not paying for their tries. And generally what this takes is you can talk to Innocence Projects and they will get hundreds of letters from inmates saying, I'm innocent, here's what I have. And very few of those cases get picked up, and maybe more of them should. I mean, I talked to Frankie, who spent 19 and a half years inside prison. I said, how many more innocent guys like you are there? And he goes, there's a few. Not a lot, but there's a few. And I tell the story. When I started at San Quentin in 1978, they told me every inmate's going to tell you they're innocent. And I said, really? So, I'm working those tiers, and I never had any inmate tell me they were innocent. Not even the Jewish chaplain's clerk, who after 20-some years in state prison, DNA proved he shouldn't have been there, and he was exonerated. And I ran into that guy every day. You would have thought he would have said, Warden, I want you to know I'm the one innocent guy inside San Quentin. Not one time did he tell me that. So, I know that what we do know, people say, is there any innocent people on death row at San Quentin? And my answer is this: we simply don't know. We don't know. And that's really a big reason to get rid of the death penalty.
Could you talk about what, if there is such a thing, a normal day? Who do you meet? Do you interact with inmates every day? What exactly do you do?
So a normal day as a warden, you know, it's like, I describe it like being the mayor of a city that has a lot more excitement than Mill Valley, because there's a lot going on. I mean, you know, you run San Quentin, you have a school, you have a healthcare facility, you have dental you have to worry about, you have physicians, you have, I think I had 17 different unions that I had to deal with. And then there's this handful of inmates, you know, 6,200. You know, very little of your time is really spent worrying about the inmates because they get into their routine and they do what they're supposed to do. And I think the great joy of my job was walking inside the prison and talking to staff and inmates. I mean, you're reminded why you're there. But I define public safety broadly. I mean, when people would say to me, why do you try to bring in programs to inmates? And I would say, I want you to know that I parole 200 people a week, and I care about who I'm paroling. You should care about who I'm paroling. And so that's how I define public safety. Yeah.
You're talking about the prison, but talk about the prison itself. San Quentin is where all the parole inmates are housed, at least that level. And to close that particular prison, as I understand it, of course, because it is so ancient and decrepit, it costs $134 million a year more, or something like that, to operate that prison that does a more modern prison. So the state would benefit not only from closing that prison, but selling that property off to, I would think, a developer, which would be worth quite a bit of money to the state itself. Comment about that?
I don't think that. It depends on who you're housing at San Quentin. If you're housing general population level 2 inmates, the expense is not greater than other prisons. If you're housing death row at San Quentin, yes. If you're housing a reception center there, that can be quite costly because it's the wrong mission for that prison. What I love about San Quentin being in the Bay Area is you drive by it every day and you have to think about these issues. And I think we should think about these issues. What I also love about San Quentin is that there's so many programs there for people who are paroling next door to you or in your community. Because I tell people this story. I put in my address into a computer that we have in the Department of Corrections in paroles to find out how many people lived within 5 miles of me who are on parole. And the number was 500. 500 live within 5 miles of my home. We need to care about who's returning to our communities, and the fact that we're able to provide so many programs at San Quentin and give people an opportunity to change their lives, I think is of great value. But I realize that I'm, up against many people who see that as a beautiful view, which it is, and have other thoughts about what you should do with that property. But that's my point of view.
I would just like to invite everybody that hasn't been into San Quentin to make the effort to go in and mingle with the prisoners and be involved with some of the teaching and the services. It changes your whole life. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. You've been wonderful to stay here so long tonight. Thank you.